All right, so you've shared some fascinating research with us, the conversations you had with this AI named P that's designed, and it's really interesting to simulate an undecided voter in the upcoming election. And then in your notes, you mentioned something about how P tends towards both sidesism and skillfully dodges tough questions. So I'm really curious to unpack how this AI navigates the treacherous waters of modern political discourse, especially when it comes to this election and the two candidates.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because P is supposed to be politically neutral, right? It forms opinions solely based on the information that's provided to it. And so, in a way, it's kind of like a blank slate reacting to the current political landscape.
Right. It's like we're watching someone taste test political discourse for the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah. They might not know the full history behind it, but they can tell you if it leaves a bad taste in their mouth.
Exactly.
Where do we even begin with P and its take on this whole thing?
Well, one of the first things that struck me was how P defines certain terms that we hear quite often in the political sphere.
Mm.
Terms like populist and cult-like, and, we throw those terms around a lot. But it seemed like P really tried to like grapple with the emotional weight behind those words, not just their dictionary definitions.
Right.
For example, when we were talking about like cult-like following in politics, P actually said something like, it seems like some politicians benefit from fostering unwavering loyalty, even if it means overlooking potential flaws.
Interesting. So it seems to understand that for a lot of voters, these words represent something deeper than just political labels. It's that it taps into that feeling of being unheard of a system that's rigged against them,
Yeah.
that us versus them mentality. Did he ever actually use that phrase?
It didn't use the phrase us versus them directly,
Got it.
but it definitely identified like the players in this whole political drama. And I think that speaks to that same idea. And remember, we're talking about a simulated, undecided voter here.
Mhm.
So how it even defines those sides, I think, is very telling.
So who does P place on each side of that?
Well, it seemed to kind of align the us with everyday working class people, families struggling to make ends, meet small business owners feeling the economic squeeze, basically anyone who feels like the system is not working for them.
And who is the them?
P pointed to the perceived power players, the political elite, big corporations, mainstream media, even government bureaucracy, basically, those who appear to be in control while everyone else is just trying to keep up.
So it's the classic populist narrative.
Exactly.
And P, despite being an AI, it seems to recognize how effectively that narrative is being used in this election.
Absolutely. And in fact, at one point, P even noted that politicians seem to benefit from keeping the focus on the other, even if those differences are exaggerated or even fabricated.
So they're using this divide and conquer strategy to their advantage.
Exactly. And it even went so far as to say that, creating an enemy can be a powerful way to unite people, even if it comes at the expense of truth or accuracy.
That's a chillingly astute observation from an AI.
It really is.
But P isn't just passively observing this dynamic,
Yeah.
right? Your notes mention a shift, almost a growing concern with this approach.
Yes, and that's where P's neutrality starts to get really, really interesting, especially when the conversation shifts to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Because he's become kind of like the poster child for this type of rhetoric, right?
Exactly. And what I find really interesting is that initially, P seemed drawn to certain aspects of Trump's communication style,
Mm.
especially that ability to connect on like an emotional level. Did you get that sense?
Yeah, I did. I mean, it even commented on his ability to cut through what it called like the noise and just speak directly to voters' concerns. So I think it definitely recognized the appeal of that, even if it didn't necessarily fully endorse, the message itself.
It's interesting because that's a common critique you hear from voters across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
They feel spoken down to. They feel like politicians are out of touch. And so while they might not agree with everything Trump says, they appreciate that he at least seems to be speaking their language.
Right, and P picked up on that too. I mean, it even said something like, Trump's language might not always be politically correct, but it's clear and it's relatable. So there's a definite acknowledgement there.
But then, as your notes highlight, there's a noticeable shift, almost a sense of P, starting to see the other side of the coin when it comes to this approach. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. And I think that shift really became apparent when we started discussing the January 6th Capitol riot.
And for our listeners who might not recall all the details, that was when a mob of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol building, in an attempt to overturn the 2020 election results.
Right, exactly. And so it's like, at this point, P was really being forced to confront the potential consequences of this type of rhetoric, of this kind of populism that Trump really embodies.
And what was P's response when you brought that up?
Well, when I brought up January 6th, it said, events like January 6th make me question whether appealing to people's anger and frustration, even if it's genuine, is ultimately good for democracy.
Wow. So it's like P is recognizing that fine line between, rallying a base and inciting something far more dangerous.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I actually followed up on that and asked P, how it reconciled that concern with its earlier observation that Trump's communication style was effective.
Okay. And what did it say?
It said, effectiveness and responsibility are not always the same thing.
That's such a nuanced response, especially coming from an AI. It's clearly grappling with this tension between what's appealing on the surface
Yeah.
and what might be harmful in the long run.
Exactly. And it made a similar point when we were discussing, Trump's policies. I mean, initially, P seemed to understand the appeal of some of them, particularly those related to, what you might call economic nationalism, things like renegotiating trade deals, bringing back manufacturing jobs, basically policies that resonated with voters who felt like they'd been left behind.
Policies that played into that us versus them narrative we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And P even acknowledged that, these policies, regardless of their actual effectiveness, they tapped into a very real sense of economic anxiety and a desire for change. Even said people want to feel like their leaders are fighting for them.
So it gets the appeal, but did it see any downsides to this approach?
Well, that's where the conversation took another fascinating turn because remember, P is designed to analyze information objectively. It doesn't have any emotional baggage, no pre-existing biases, just cold, hard analysis.
No emotional baggage, no pre-existing biases,
Yeah.
just cold, hard analysis. And what did that analysis reveal when it came to Trump's policies?
Well, that's where P surprised me because as it dug deeper into, the potential long-term consequences, it started expressing concerns. Like, for example, we talked about Trump's approach to immigration.
Yeah.
And P recognized that his hardline stance, like building a wall, it appealed to some voters, especially those who feel threatened. But it also questioned whether those policies were actually effective and sustainable in, addressing the complexities of immigration.
So it was thinking beyond just the surface level appeal and considering the bigger picture. Did you get a sense that this kind of critical thinking, did it extend to other policy areas as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about Trump's tax cuts, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And while P acknowledged that, they were popular with some, it also raised questions about their long-term economic impact and whether they actually exacerbated existing inequalities.
Again, looking past the immediate win and considering potential consequences down the road. It's interesting because it's like P is starting to use that same critical lens that it applied to Trump's rhetoric, but now it's evaluating his actual policies.
Exactly. And this is where I think P's evolution, for lack of a better term, becomes really compelling because it began weighing the potential benefits of Trump's policies against what it perceived as very real potential risks, especially to things like stability and unity. And remember, these were the values it identified with earlier, those everyday people who were just struggling to get by. It was like P was holding these policies up against that internal compass and finding that they didn't quite align.
So circling back to where we started, how does this all relate to P's stance as an undecided voter? Did it ultimately land on a decision?
That's the most interesting part. While P never definitively said, I wouldn't vote for Trump, by the end, it clearly expressed doubt. Like, I specifically asked, based on everything we discussed, what concerned it most about a potential Trump presidency.
Okay.
And its response. The potential for increased division, erosion of democratic norms, and unpredictable decision-making gives me pause.
Wow. And remember, this is from an AI that is designed for neutrality. It really is fascinating and honestly a bit unsettling to see how P grappled with these very complex political realities, particularly those strategies that are used to sway voters.
It really highlights how important critical thinking is, especially in this age of information overload. P, in its own way, it kind of provides a roadmap for how we can all engage with political discourse a little bit better.
Yeah.
It was willing to ask tough questions, consider different viewpoints, and then adjust its opinions based on new information.
It's a good reminder for all of us to be more like P in that sense.
Right.
To question our assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, and be wary of anyone claiming to have all the answers.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. Thanks for walking us through these fascinating conversations.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this is giving you some food for thought as we continue to navigate this very complex and ever-evolving political landscape. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, keep asking those tough questions.